Hello, my name is Joshua Keith, and this is theburningcoal.com, a website dedicated to God's glory, His grace, and our response to it. Today we're going to be looking at profiles of faith, and in particular we're going to be looking at David. Now with David, there are quite a few accounts that we could refer to and learn from, and in fact we probably will in future lessons. But today I want us to talk about David versus Goliath. Now, sometimes we can marginalize this account because it's something that we heard time and time again as a child. And as we have kids, we tell our children about it, and it becomes one of many stories that we may look at. But if we're not careful, we can allow this passage to lose its power in our life. And it really is a powerful account. Its job is to give us strength and to fight in our battles that we're in. And we've talked about this recently, but sometimes we forget that we are actually in a war of our own. And we could be facing many different Goliaths. You could look at Goliath as being Satan himself, the roaring lion, seeking who he could devour. But also we're arrayed against the government. The government does not believe in God, does not try to follow God's law, and sets things up that are specifically against it. We are arrayed against our culture. Our culture has gone away from God completely. And in many ways, the idea of believing in God and believing that you have to obey His word and going to a consistent religious service and being a part of a church, a body, those things are mocked and thought of as not important. And so we are besieged on every side in this war. And so that's why it's so important to go back and look at David with fresh eyes and to be motivated by his heart and his desire, and to see if we have that same mindset within ourselves. So let's start just by reviewing the account of what's going to happen. And this happens in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And the entire chapter is dedicated to talking about David versus Goliath. And Goliath is this beast of a man. He is just huge. And he goes out from the Philistines. They're arrayed against each other in these battle lines, and no one's really made the first move yet. So every morning, Goliath goes out and he challenges the people of God. And Saul himself is a tall man. There are different warriors within the people of Israel. But when it comes to physical stature, they do not match up at all. They are nowhere near the size of Goliath. So what Goliath does is he says, let's do this. We could have this huge long war, but instead, let's have a battle man versus man. One-on-one. You send your best fighter out to me, and I'll come out and fight him, and the winner gets dominion over the other nation. Well, the people are terrified. The Israelites, they're cowering because they can't imagine who could stand up and go and fight against Goliath. Not only are they afraid for themselves, they know that they don't have the ability to stand up to Goliath in that fight, but they look around and they don't see anybody else who would be able to take on that battle. And so they're just terrified. And so Goliath just comes out and he's constantly taunting the people of God, day after day. So David comes to the people. He's not actually a part of the army. We find out that he's actually he's the youngest son, and he goes to see his oldest brothers who are in the army. He goes back and forth between shepherding the sheep, and his father says, here, take this stuff to your brothers, take it to their commanders. And so David goes. And while David is here, he hears Goliath's taunt, and he asks about it. And so the people tell him what's going on and tell him that Saul himself is scared, and he's saying, anybody who's willing to take this challenge, if you win, you are going to get a great reward. Well, David's brother comes and says, what are you doing here? Why aren't you taking care of our sheep? You're supposed to be taking care of the sheep. And so he gets rebuked by his brother. And David's like, what? I was just asking what was going on and what would happen for those who would fight. But then he goes and he asks some more, and people are reporting back to Saul that David is seemingly interested in this battle. And that's exactly what happens. David is brought before Saul, and he requests to fight against Goliath. Now, this is pretty amazing in and of itself, and you can tell how scared the Israelites, and in fact King Saul is, in that he even considers this shepherd boy coming to fight. Saul does not know what to do. He is lost. He is confused. He is scared. As the king, he should be the one taking this fight, but he doesn't. And so when someone comes and is willing to take the fight for him, he jumps all over that. Now, he does want to send him out in Saul's armor. And David tries to put it on, but it doesn't fit right. It's too big because Saul is one of the larger Israelites. And David says, don't worry about it. I don't need this armor. I can go without. And you can see, again, the contrast between David and Saul's attitude here. Saul is unwilling to fight, even with his armor. And is so desperate for someone to take it on that he's offering a reward and he's considering the shepherd boy. David says, I'll go and fight. Okay, well, let's put some armor on you. This armor doesn't work. It's just going to slow me down. So does that mean you're not going to fight? No. I'll go and fight anyway. I don't need the armor. I used to do this thing all the time with the sheep. I've taken on the bear. I've taken on the lion. I can just go and fight as a shepherd would. And so David is sent out to Goliath. He meets him for his challenge. And they both taunt one another. And then they go into battle. And David takes his sling. He has a stone that he found. He takes the sling and he fires the sling at Goliath. It hits Goliath in the head, underneath his helmet, sinks in, and he falls down. And then David comes and he takes Goliath's own sword because all he came out with was a staff. He takes Goliath's own sword and cuts off Goliath's head. And so the people of God are victorious because David went out and fought Goliath. The Philistines then run away, and the people of Israel emboldened chase them in their victory. So again, this is something that we've heard many times. We've gone through this story many times. But what is it that we can learn from David's account here, from what David had done? What's David's example that we can take away from? And I think one of the first things that we can learn is how David was not going to be discouraged by others. Time and time again, David was put in a position to be discouraged and beat down by others, to decide that this fight wasn't worth it because of what other people were either saying or were doing. First of all, he did not let the fear of the people intimidate him. So David comes in and he sees this taunt. And he sees Goliath, and he sees Goliath as a big man. And you can see that as that happens, or maybe if he heard about it as he was coming up, he would at first be emboldened and say, yes, this is fine. I can handle this. God will take care of us. But then he looks around and everybody's nervous. And this has been happening for a while. So much so that the king himself is willing to offer this prize for who would come into the fight. And so David sees that the people flee from Goliath and were very afraid. When we look around and we see those around us afraid, it can make us afraid too. We can take our boldness, and instead of being bold, we draw back within ourselves. Because obviously those people are right to be afraid. And so we can be distracted even if we are at first excited and ready to fight. We see others shirking, and we ourselves shirk back as well. David was not like that. He did not let how other people viewed the situation influence what he knew to be true. It did not influence his actions in the slightest. He knew that God was on his side, that God would bring the victory, and so he was going to step forward. On top of that, he comes to his family and he has his older brother bring a rebuke to him. What are you doing? I know that you're just here. You've abandoned the family. Why have you come down? David could have said, oh, man, my brother, who's the one in the army, he doesn't want me here. He obviously thinks that I shouldn't be here, that I should go back home. You know what? I'm going to pack up and go home. He did not let the fact that his brother didn't like the questions that he was asking. And we don't know what the brother's motivation was. Maybe it was because he was really worried about the family. Or maybe, as we sometimes do, we project things onto other people. And we, in our embarrassment, give out rebukes because we are embarrassed that we are not willing to stand up for what is right. Whatever the case may be, those rebukes, when people come against us and they tell us that we're wrong, and we're supposed to be on the same side, and now they're fighting against us, that can be discouraging. That can cause us to quit. Say, you know what? Fine, fight your own battles. But that's not what David does. He doesn't let a rebuke get in his way. He also is not bothered in the least by Goliath's taunt. We see that Goliath says, "Come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." You know, David had heard his taunt earlier. And now he goes around and he asks and he has this confidence. And there are times where we work ourselves up and we say, yes, this is who I'm going to be, this is what I'm going to do, and I can handle this situation. And then we get there and we look that confrontation in the face, we hear their voice talking to us, and again we wither away from the mindset that we're supposed to have. When David comes face to face with the Philistine, when he sees him in all his military might, when he hears his booming voice, he could have wilted. He could have said, you know what? Maybe I'll try this again tomorrow. But he doesn't. He goes on to the fight. There are a lot of excuses we can make for not standing up for what we know to be right, for not going to fight the battle. Other people discouraged me. Other people rebuked me. Other people were in my way. It was harder than I thought it was going to be. It was a bigger, stronger enemy than I expected to face. But those are just excuses. David was not discouraged by what other people did. He was convicted in his heart that God would bring him the victory, and it did not matter how anybody else acted or what anybody else said. He would not be persuaded of anything else. He knew that he would have victory. We need to make sure that we are not discouraged by others, that we are willing to put in the fight no matter what happens with anybody else around us. And we hope that, as David has in the future, that we have a Jonathan there bolstering us. But Jonathan goes to David after this fight. David went and had this fight on his own because it was what was right. Because God was on his side. And as much as other people are helpful, as long as we have God, we will be victorious. Another lesson that we can learn is the fact that David's past prepared him. When he goes and he talks to Saul about the fact that he is going to fight and that it's fine, it's not a big deal. I can go to this battle even without armor. David says to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went out and fought them. David was not new to the battle. He had gone and fought a lion and a bear, and he had done it with his sling and his staff. He didn't need armor because he was prepared and knew how to fight already. It's important for us to remember this because sometimes as we go through our battles, we may ask why God is allowing this to happen. Why do we have to handle this situation? And one of the things that we see is that David could have been upset about the fact that a lion or a bear was going to his sheep. And in fact, the fact that that happened, he could have said, you know what, I have to let them go, they die. Why is God putting me in this situation? That wasn't the attitude that David had. Instead, he was willing to fight for his sheep. And those battles prepared him for the next one. And so as we go through things that we're not sure why we have to fight this battle, why it's happening like this, why we're suffering like this, understand that God will use our past to prepare us for the future, so that we can be battle-hardened and ready for the next fight, so that when Goliath comes, we can stand strong. And so we should not be discouraged about the fights that we're going, and the fact that sometimes that they are hard, and sometimes we may be alone in those fights because others are discouraging. God is with you, and He is preparing you to be victorious. And along with that, we need to remember that David went to battle. And you have to love what David does here. And my dad has always emphasized this when talking about this. It says, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. Was David afraid? Not in the slightest, because he knew God was on his side. And so when David went to battle, he didn't timidly grab his sling and his staff and try to figure it. He sprinted towards the Philistine. He was like, let's do this. I am ready for this fight. When we are wanting God to help us, we need to ask ourselves if we're actually going into the battle. Because I imagine that Saul was praying to the Lord that his Goliath problem would go away. But Saul did not go to battle himself. One of the things that we forget is that God uses us to bring about the victories. And that God needs us to fight too. God does not do everything on behalf of us. He does a lot. He will provide the victory, no doubt, but He needs us to go to war. And a lot of times, especially when we're beaten and battered by suffering, when we're facing our Goliath, whatever that may look like, we cower down and we pray, God save us, but we don't actually go to fight with Him. We don't run quickly toward the battle line. We don't sprint to the fight. We just lay down and hope that God is going to bring us the victory regardless. That's not what we do in these fights. we go to battle. That's why Paul tells us to put on the armor of God, is because we need to go into the fight and are ready to fight on God's behalf. Yes, God brings us the victory, but he doesn't do it against our own actions. And so we need to be willing to fight. We need to be willing to pray. We need to put on that armor, and we need to stand up and say, I will not fall to Goliath. I will fight against Goliath. I will be victorious because my God brings me the victory. And that is the most important thing for us to understand, is that God provided the victory. Here's what David tells Goliath about what's going to happen. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all the assembly may know that the Lord saves not with the sword or spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. David makes very clear what everybody should learn, that all the earth may know. We're about to come into March Madness season. And you're going to hear about David and Goliath a lot in those basketball tournaments. You know why? Because people have the lesson right here and they refuse to learn it. This is not about the underdog being able to defeat someone that it was only like a 90% chance that they would win, not a 100% chance. That's not what God wanted us to learn. That's not what David wanted us to learn from this fight. It was not about an underdog being successful against the odds. This fight was about God. And the fact of the matter is that Goliath never had a chance. It was not that David only had a small chance. It was that Goliath had no chance, because God was providing the victory. Satan has no chance. The people of this world, they have no chance. They cannot defeat you because God provides the victory. If you suit up and you fight, you will not lose. You may not have everything you hoped for in this life. You may even die in your faith. But the ultimate victory, the victory that comes after this life, God gives that to you. He will provide that victory. And it is not, boy, it's a 20% chance that you will be saved. If only you can just get the sling to have the shot in the right spot. No, it is assured. You will win. Never forget that. When David went to battle, this is not what he said afterwards. He did not say, you know what, God gave me the battle. When David went to battle, one of the reasons why all of this was so easy for him, why he had this attitude and did all the things we've been talking about before, is because he knew this fact. He already knew it, but now it was time for everybody else to know. Do you already know the fact that God is providing the victory? That he will help you overcome all things that you face? Or do we have fear and trepidation like the rest of the Israelites? Are we unwilling to go to battle because we think we will lose? Because we don't believe that God will bring us that victory? David, with his faith, shows us that we have nothing to fear. If God is for us, who can be against us? I hope this lesson helps you in your walk in his kingdom.